Today on Inside Utah Politics, the year that was. From impeachment proceedings against the president to a major overhaul of the state tax system. 2019 brought us some big developments. We're breaking down the top stories of the year. Plus, Utah Representative Chris Stewart is calling on the president to stick to his guns on the vaping crisis, why he says it's critical to ban flavored e-cigarette products.
Time now for Inside Utah Politics.
Good Sunday morning, and thanks so much for joining us. I'm Glenn Mills. It is time to go inside Utah politics. The year, it is winding down, and the events that unfolded are sure to impact us for years to come. This morning, we are looking back at the big stories and what they mean moving forward. Along with input from our panel, we put together the top 5 political developments of 2019. Those top stories include impeachment proceedings against the President of the United States, and specifically the role members of Utah's delegation played. The tax reform bill, passed by the legislature in a special session. Governor Herbert proposing a new administrative rule to ban conversion therapy after legislative efforts fell short. A new mayor for Utah's capital city. And the race to be Utah's next governor takes shape. All right, we turn now to our year in review panel. Matt Canham is the senior managing editor at the Salt Lake Tribune, and Boyd Matheson is the opinion editor for the Deseret News. Gentlemen, great to have you with us. Thanks for being here.
Great to be here.
That went by quick. You guys sat in this exact same spot last year as we did this. What a year this has been.
Yeah, crazy.
It's been unreal. From the start to the end, we've had a lot of dynamic things happen.
And a lot of divisive things really stand out this year as well. Let's go ahead and get right into this. The impeachment of the President of the United States. Boyd, not only is this historic, but extremely divisive.
Yeah, it has been divisive, and I think a lot of that is because of both political parties. I'd be interesting to see what the numbers were over the past couple of weeks, just in terms of how much money was raised by both political parties off of impeachment, as you said, Glenn, as a wedge issue. And so it became less and less about the process, less and less about getting to the truth, more and more about the politics, which is why Congress has an approval rating of about 9%, which is right around Raul Castro and the influenza virus. And more importantly, the people have lost trust in the institution, and that's what actually worries me the most.
Yeah, so what you're saying is that's not good.
It's not good.
Okay. Matt, let's bring you in. This is very rare, but here we are.
Right.
And there's been some concern that, is this going to be the standard going forward?
Well, and you heard that from Representative Chris Stewart when they were debating whether to vote on the articles of impeachment. He said that if you impeach Donald Trump, you're going to impeach the next president too. We live in a time where both parties essentially have their own set of facts. They can't even agree if the president's actions were wrong, let alone impeachable. And the idea being that if that means that if you have a president of one party and a House of another, will this be the norm going forward? I don't know if that's necessarily the case. You still need to do something that one party feels is so egregious that it's a high crime or misdemeanor. And in this case, what the Democrats are saying is that the president meddled with our election system, which is clearly a fundamental part of our system. Will we see that in the next president? We didn't see it under Bush. We didn't see it under Obama. Whoever's next, we don't know.
Yeah. Well, although we have seen a lot of an increase in the number of articles of impeachment or impeachment resolutions from
not
Reagan.
necessarily getting to this point.
Right. Yeah. So Reagan had 2, H.W. Bush had 2, Clinton obviously was impeached, but then you go to George W. Bush. I think there were 16 or so. President Obama, I think there were 20. So it is becoming a weaponized tool for the political parties.
Just to emphasize on that real quick, this is the 4th time we've been to this point in the process.
Yes.
The 3rd president to be impeached. Nixon likely would have been, but he resigned, obviously. But there's something different here. President Trump, I think we all agree when it goes to the Senate, he's not going to be convicted.
No.
So he's going to run again on this.
Yes.
We haven't seen that before. What impact will that have on 2020?
I don't know if it'll have any impact, unfortunately. I do think that this should be a rare tool, and then it should feel weighty.
Yeah.
But opinions are so locked, particularly on this individual, that will this change anything? I don't know if we'll even be talking about impeachment when we get to the end of this presidential election.
The president will probably be talking about it.
He might.
At the end.
Because it's going to fuel his campaign, don't you think?
That's right. And interesting, recent polling has shown that I think 35% of Americans think that the impeachment proceedings will help the president in his reelection. About 25% that say it won't, and the rest think it won't have any impact at all. And who knows what we'll be talking about as we get into the fall. I think the risk for the Democrats is the longer the proceedings proceedings go on, the more they are the party of impeachment. And Nancy Pelosi, Chairman Schiff, and Chairman Nadler are the face, not their nominee or who their nominee might be. That's the risk for the Democrats. The Republicans, on the other hand, if they end up defending the indefensible, and people say, nah, that's really not credible anymore, and I'm exhausted by it. It's interesting because a lot of the voters are so exhausted, especially in places like Wisconsin, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Michigan. They're all withdrawing from it. There's a new class of voters emerging, about 21%, that are the movable middle. They're not independents, so they're either declared Democrats or Republicans. They tend to switch as the things go on, but they don't get moved by this. They disconnect. Their choice on Election Day will be, do I go vote or not? They're a big group. It's a growing interest.
Matt, one thing I'd like to hit on with you, I bring this up all the time, but it's something that's pretty impactful. Not long ago, we heard Bernie Sanders say, if all we do is talk about Trump, we're going to lose to Trump.
Right.
Here we are, and wouldn't you agree, we're talking about Trump?
I do think that's why the Democrats set the timeline they did. So the president is now impeached. In January, we have the trial, the Senate. Republicans have said that will be a short trial. We've already assumed the outcome here. At which point, Democrats can now shift. This is sucking all the oxygen away from those presidential candidates.
Right.
They are now going to reemerge when it's Super Tuesday here in Utah in March. And then as this thing goes, it becomes a decision between Trump and whoever that candidate is. And that's why that conversation will probably shift largely away from impeachment towards who these people are.
Let's look specifically at the role members of Utah's delegation played. Let's start with Representative Chris Stewart on the committee that really, where we saw this all start, the Intelligence Committee. He, on this issue, no doubt has been an unabashed supporter of President Trump. How does that play out in his district?
Yeah, again, I don't think it's going to be one of those big difference makers for Chris Stewart in the 2nd district. He made his case. He's gone on, all the different cable shows on all the different issues, and I think he's in a pretty comfortable space there. It'll be interesting to see if he gets challenged in terms of primary by a significant person. That could change the dynamic a little bit. But again, Utah voters are about 50-50 in terms of their relationship with President Trump and whether they want 4 more years of that. To me, that's going to be the interesting dynamic. If the economy keeps churning along, if Utah keeps having real good success, makes it harder for people to vote the other side out.
What about Representative McAdams in the 4th District? The lone Democrat in our congressional delegation, he decided, I'm going to vote yes on these articles of impeachment.
This is his first year in office, and he has this huge vote. He's an endangered Democrat to begin with, won by about 700 votes.
Right.
He has had an agonizing path to this decision.
To that point, before you go on, he really didn't have a win-win situation in this.
No, and that's fine. We elect people to make hard choices. I don't have any sympathy for a member of Congress having to decide how to vote. But he agonized over whether to support an inquiry to begin with. And then when it came here, he said he looked at the data, he read all of the transcripts. He said he did it off of primary sources, and he came up with the decision that he felt was defensible. It is also the decision that the majority of these endangered Democrats have decided. They're backing this, they backed this impeachment. So how that plays going forward, we'll find out, but I think it will have an impact on how people campaign against him for sure.
Okay, we'll be watching that. Let's move on to tax reform. Another pretty divisive issue here in the state. A major impact on our system. Why was it so controversial?
Well, it's one of those where speed is always a challenge, and so when they're trying to accelerate things, something as complicated as overhauling the tax system, that's a big deal. I mean, I applaud the legislature for going after it because we do need to change. Things are changing. But I think the work they did in the special session is good, but you also have to say that the job is begun, but it's really only half done. We haven't secured education funding. There's a lot of unknowns there that I think are yet to play out in the upcoming legislature.
Another unknown is how a referendum can play out for citizens trying to reverse this thing altogether.
There were parts that people didn't like increasing the sales tax on food, or what it does do to education in particular, were 2 big things that people constantly talked about. I did not hear people largely complaining about getting an income tax reduction. That seems to be okay. But there are people who want this to go to the voters. I think the hard part, as Boyd talked about in process, lots of public hearings, but this thing happened in a special session released late, around the holidays. That does leave a taste in the mouth of opponents to this. They're going to try a long shot measure to get this before voters. I don't expect that to be successful. It's very difficult in our state to do that.
And I do think it's important too that the ramifications in terms of the poor and the most vulnerable is still a big question, especially as it relates to the food tax.
Yeah.
I also think there's a lot of those in the legislature, and I think a lot of citizens are questioning, you started with this very long list of services that were going to be taxed, and at the end, it was a very small list, and you can kind of go through and look at the lobbying dollars and the lobbying commitments, and something played out. It'd be interesting to know what really happened. Why did the list go from this big to this small, and who's on there and why? Says a lot in terms of what happened lobbying-wise, who had the biggest voice.
And there's no doubt people were very loud on that point. That's what they really didn't like in the bill that went through the legislature. I've heard conversations of fixes in the upcoming legislative session, like making the vouchers immediate, and so that you don't have to apply for them. Is that something that maybe the legislature could get more people on board with?
They even talked about it. I mean, the idea is to get, as Boyd said, they wanted to get halfway down the field here. They're going to come back in the session. There'll be other things they talk about. I can't imagine this bill doesn't have some tweaks that would make it, that would probably address some of the opponents' issues, as well as in particular education, funding. When you cut the income tax collections, you're cutting money that goes to education.
Right.
What are you going to do about that? They have to address that.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, we're going to take a quick break, but we still have more stories to get to, so you gentlemen stick around, and we will be right back to continue our breakdown of the top stories of the year. Stay with us.
You're watching Inside Utah Politics.
Welcome back. We continue our in-depth look at the year's top political stories. Boyd Matheson is the opinion editor for the Deseret News, and Matt Canham is the senior managing editor for the Salt Lake Tribune. All right, let's get right into this, you guys. Conversion therapy. We saw this play out in the legislative session. It really became quite bitter. It got to the point where advocates were very hopeful, but a substitute bill came in. Death threats came in against the person who brought in that substitute bill. Why did it turn out that way in the beginning?
Yeah, I think it's one of those issues that doing it through the legislative part of things was just didn't seem to have any traction. Little spurts here, and you had advocacy groups on both sides really playing out, and I think the legislature didn't get it engaged early enough. And so it's hard to get a good compromise when you're under pressure at the end of a session. And so that's why I think we ended up where we are with things coming from the executive branch.
Yeah.
And that's an interesting debate too. What should be done through the executive branch versus the legislative branch is interesting.
Let's stick with that, because what we had here is, instead of going legislative, the governor proposes a rule administratively. What do you make of that route, going that way, as opposed to trying to get it done through the legislature?
The interesting part is he got that idea from activists who sat outside his office and demanded an apology for him not backing the bill during the legislature. One of those activists brought up, why don't we just do it by a rule? The governor thought about it and said, maybe I didn't make the best decision there. Maybe I can try this a different way. I applaud an elected official listening to a constituent and taking action. We have lots of ways that we govern different types of professions. And this is one where this is a practice that is disavowed by pretty much everybody. So those professional institutions were all about doing this by rule. So it actually was an interesting pathway.
One thing I want to ask you guys about on this is, I should have looked at the exact number of states, but it's less than half.
19.
19. Okay, so we become the 19th. I knew it was in the high teens. Again, Utah, you wouldn't think, looking back, Utah would be, in the leading edge of getting this done. We've seen that with non-discrimination and LGBTQ rights bill. Right. We've seen that with medical marijuana. Is this another area where Utah is kind of surprising the nation?
I don't know if I would say it's surprising. I actually think the other was. I think because this is an issue that people here deal with, if you have a different gender identity or sexual orientation, then that conflicts with some of your beliefs. You're going to hit that more head on. So it probably happens here more, or have been a bigger part of the conversation here. You also have the LDS Church, which has already decided that this is a bad policy. This is a bad way to go. So then it's just negotiating the details. You know, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints was neutral in the bill during the session, which is a sign that they were ready for this to happen. So then it says, how do we get there? So in some ways, I think it isn't that surprising.
Yeah, and I agree. It's not surprising to people in Utah. It's surprising to people across the country, because the country has become conditioned that when you have things that appear to be a false choice, you either have to be, LGBTQ rights or religious liberty rights, those are often false choices. And the governor proved that, and he proved really the Utah model, that the solution to any problem begins when someone says, let's talk about it. And you get the right people in the room, you get past the talking points, you agree that these polar opposites are fake fights and false choices, and that there is a way to get to the right kind of compromise. The integrity of compromise is what I think Utah does best, and that is real compromise. You bring everything to the table and you really do come out with a good solution.
Let's move on to another big story of the year, a new mayor for Utah's capital city. First, that entailed the current mayor, Jackie Biskupski, bowing out of the race.
Right.
What will her legacy be?
That's a tough question. Jackie has made, the mayor, Biskupski, has made a lot of decisions that impact air quality that she worked very hard on. We see downtown rising that will be part of her legacy. She's put a lot of plans in place, the nuts and bolts work of a mayor. She also had a lot of divisive relationships. She did not get along with the city council. She did not get along with the governor or the legislature, even though she started having some allies there. And she kind of isolated herself, I think.
I want to get into those relationships in a bit, but first, let's talk about how the race unfolded, because a year ago, it looked like Jim DeBacchus had an insurmountable lead. Here comes Erin Mendenhall, who didn't even enter the race, by the way, until Mayor Biskupski announced that she was out, and she came up and won the race. How did that all happen?
Yeah, and that was also not surprising, because it was all about the disciplines, practical, tactical, boots on the ground, knocking doors. She had an extraordinary structure in place with disciplines. And so while the polls were saying Senator DeBacchus was way ahead on a middle of the summer primary, off-year election, it's all about ground game, organization, and discipline, and she showed that that works. And again, without a plurality rule in there, she was able to win that primary with, what, 22, 23% of the vote.
Well, and I think DeBacchus is someone that everyone knew and you had an opinion on. He was very well known in our city, and I think that there were people who liked him, and there were plenty who decided he wasn't their favorite, and so he didn't have a lot of area to grow.
Okay, so real quick, back to the relationship part. We saw the governor show up to Erin's victory party on election night. What does that signal moving ahead with the relationship between the city and state?
It shows that Erin wants to be a relationship-building mayor, that she already has an established relationship with our governor. They've worked on air quality issues together. He donated to her campaign. I think it's a turning of the page, though I don't think the policy objectives of Mayor Biskupski and soon-to-be Mayor Mendenhall are that different.
Okay, let's move on. I kind of heard some foreshadowing as you guys were talking about this mayor's race as we look into the race for governor.
Yes.
We have 4 Republicans officially in. What do you make of this race at this point?
Yeah, I think you will have more to come as we get early into the new year. I think you could have 2 or 3 more significant names get into that race. With the dual track system, it is not out of the question that you could have 5 Republicans on the primary ballot in a very late June. It's only a few days before.
I think I just heard you say that.
Yes.
It's really late in the, it's a couple of days before the 4th of July weekend.
Yeah.
So organization, structure, it's going to be much more an organization campaign than a name ID. A lot of the early polls are clearly name ID polls, but this is going to be a boots on the ground battle, I think, in the end.
And just like the mayor's race, you talked about DeBacchus having the name ID. We have candidates with the name ID in the governor's race.
Yeah, and I do think that politics is becoming more nationalized. And I think it's interesting to look at the candidates by their relationship to the president. So you have Lieutenant Governor Spencer Cox, who is not a Trump fan.
But he's kind of been quiet on that lately, though.
Right, I'm sure he has been, but it's hard to get past your past.
Especially in a presidential year, for sure.
You have former Governor John Huntsman, who worked for Trump, but has been relatively neutral in his statements. And we assume that former House Speaker Greg Hughes will get in the race, and he has been a huge Trump supporter.
Right.
When you have that plurality factor, I think in a presidential year, that actually might play a big part of this.
Yeah. So Could it be? I mean, we saw the last poll out of Utah Policy, and it showed Cox and Huntsman clear front runners in this. Could this be another situation where someone could come up and surprise us?
Yeah, I think it's one where, again, if you have 5 people in a primary, technically you could win with 21% of the vote, right? So I think that will play out. The name idea always helps early, helps in the fundraising, but this is going to be a structure and a strategy. And I think it will come down to this kind of message. I think one of the big differences will be, are we content with Utah being a crossroads of the West kind of state, or are we really interested in being a crossroads to the world with inland port and Silicon Slopes and all of those kinds of things?
I'm going to have to end it on that note. Gentlemen, thanks for being here. Great conversation. Can't believe another year just goes by like that.
Too fast.
Yep. I'll see you again next year.
We'll be here.
Good.
All right. Still to come, the major trade agreement between the U.S., Mexico, and Canada appears to be on track for passage. What impact will it have on the economy? We'll dig into that after the break. After initially calling for a ban on flavored e-cigarettes, President Trump now backing off the idea, and it's unclear what will happen next. Utah Representative Chris Stewart is calling on the president to follow through, though. Washington correspondent Alexander Lamone reports.
Republican Utah Congressman Chris Stewart is calling on President Trump to follow through on his promise to ban flavored e-cigarettes.
The manufacturers of e-cigarettes are targeting kids.
Stewart calls vaping a nationwide epidemic.
And they're not marketing to 45-year-old truck drivers with Slurpee and bubblegum flavors. They're marketing to our kids.
President Trump initially said he wanted to ban flavored e-cigarettes, but then backed off the idea over concerns about how small vaping businesses could be impacted.
Look, if your business is built on marketing e-cigarettes to kids, I think that's a bad idea. And I'll just be honest, I want to make it harder for you, not easier.
The White House is also concerned flavored products will end up on the black market. Oregon Democrat Kurt Schrader doesn't think a complete ban is necessary.
If you have Tutti Frutti vaping, that's targeted to kids. You know, menthol, that could be a different story. Maybe we got to get a little better balance on that.
Schrader also says the focus shouldn't just be on flavors.
I don't know if the flavor ban is as important as it is raising the age.
That's why a group of Democrats and Republicans is working on a deal to raise the minimum age for all tobacco purchases to 21. The hope is the bill would be included in the year-end spending package and could eventually help the country save money on healthcare costs. In Washington, Alexandra Limon.
As the United States-Mexico-Canada trade agreement appears to finally be headed for approval in Congress, the White House says Americans should expect a further economic boost from the deal. But some economists say the boost may not be that noticeable. Washington correspondent Anna Warnicki has more.
Monica Crowley with the U.S. Department of Treasury says the United States-Mexico-Canada trade deal is a win for everyone.
We've taken the bad trade deal of NAFTA, brought it up to date, modernized it, and strengthened it.
Crowley says Democrats, Republicans, and the White House all support the deal. But she says the biggest victory is for the American workers.
Hundreds of thousands of jobs for the United States. And that is going to be an incredible boost to the U.S. economy, which is already strong.
A report by the U.S. International Trade Commission says if USMCA passes, there will be an economic boost. But Michael Mandel with the Progressive Policy Institute says it won't be very noticeable.
What we have is top-line numbers that look really strong, but people don't feel as good as the numbers say.
The report says the trade deal is expected to boost the U.S. economy by less than 0.4%. That's about $68 billion.
We won't know until we see it. It's a funny situation because it's actually not a new treaty. It's replacing something that already exists.
Mandel admits that any boost in the economy is good news, especially for the industries hit hard by the recent tariffs and trade wars.
Any type of trade deal would be a plus for manufacturing and for states that are dependent on manufacturing.
About 2 million manufacturing jobs depend on trade within the North American market, so we really need to get that over the finish line.
The House is expected to vote on the USMCA trade deal as early as this week. In Washington, I'm Anna Warnicki.
Stay with us. We'll be right back with more Inside Utah Politics right after the break. We leave you now with a look at what's on the radar in the world of politics. The general legislative session begins next month. The 45-day session opens up on Monday, January 27th. Utah is participating in Super Tuesday for the presidential primary. That is set for Tuesday, March 3rd. And then caucus night for both Utah Republicans and Democrats is Tuesday, March 24th. Make sure to connect with me on social media. I'd like to know what you think of this show and other issues that are important to you. You can email me at InsideUtahPolitics@abc4.com. You can also follow me on Twitter and Facebook. Just log on and search Glenn Mills ABC4. Thanks so much for making us part of your Sunday morning. We hope to see you again next week as we go inside Utah politics.